Público y la erosión de la democracia liberal. Welcome to this last plenary session. My name is David Landau. I'm a professor and associate dean for international programs at Florida State University College of Law, and it is an honor for me to be chairing this session on a very important and timely topic, public law, democratic backsliding, and the erosion of democracy. I have been asked to make one announcement. At the end of this panel, we will go directly into the closing remarks by Lorenzo Casini, co-president of ICANS. There will not be a break, so please remain seated at the end of this session. This is a topic, democratic erosion and backsliding, that has caused an explosion of scholarship and interest in recent years that many of us in this room have worked on, and which was a central focus of panels at this conference. And for good reason. It is obviously a topic of enormous contemporary importance around the world, including here in Latin America, where one has seen recent projects of constitutional and legal change that have raised concerns about the stability and vibrancy of liberal democracy in some countries in the region. The concerns raised range from some fairly obvious troubling cases like Venezuela and more ambiguous developments in countries such as Brazil that are now being compared to other cases around the world. This is obviously also a topic with many facets, many open questions. Despite this outpouring of interest in academic work, these include basic questions about the scope of the problem. For example, scholars have debated whether there really is a wave of democratic retrenchment, or in other words, have asked how much trouble liberal democracy really is in and how much we should worry about it if it is. Relatedly, some work asks what, if anything, is distinctive about recent episodes of democratic erosion. Much scholarship has now observed there may be something distinctively legal about many of these episodes that is of obvious interest to this group, that they rely heavily on abusive forms of constitutional and legal change. Similarly, institutions such as courts appear to be central institutions both for the protection of democracy, but also may sometimes be complicit in indirect or direct ways in its undermining. The presentations in this session will shed light on a number of different aspects of this phenomenon. We'll start with Professor Teresa Bejan of Oxford University, who will give a historical and conceptual perspective on the widespread perception that the current crisis of democracy is a crisis of civility. Then we will hear from Professor Wojciech Sadurski of the University of Sydney and Warsaw University, who has just completed a book called Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, and who will speak in that light on the legal mechanisms that would-be authoritarian actors use to undermine democracy. Finally, Samuel Issacharoff of New York University School of Law will speak about the potential responses of courts to political actions that undermine the democratic order. So we start, as I mentioned, with Professor Teresa Bejan. Professor Bejan is Associate Professor of Political Theory and Fellow at Oriel College at the University of Oxford. She received her PhD with distinction from Yale University in 2013 and was awarded the American Political Science Association's 2015 Leo Strauss Award for the Best Dissertation in Political Philosophy. Professor Bejan's first book, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, published by Harvard University Press in 2017, was called Penetrating and Sophisticated by the New York Times. In addition, that's high praise. In addition to her many articles in academic journals and chapters in edited volumes, Professor Bejan has written on free speech and civility for The Atlantic and The Washington Post.
Great, thank you. Firstly, it's an honor to be invited to speak on this panel, and especially to be here as a political theorist and historian of political thought among so many eminent constitutional law scholars and scholars of public law. It's just really wonderful to be here. And I suppose it's my job as a historian to speak to today's very timely themes with some ancient and perhaps early modern perspectives. And so in particular, I want to speak to part of today's theme, specifically the erosion of liberal democracy from the perspective of political theory and its history. And I want to focus on some of the particular ways in which this erosion is being described or diagnosed, especially in the liberal democracies that I know best. So the United Kingdom, where I live and work, and the United States, where I'm from. And the survey is motivated by the thought that the most important work that a political theorist can do is that of really understanding and accurately diagnosing the political situation under which she lives, and that it's essential to do that work of understanding first before we can theorize or maybe even moralize about how to change it. Sometimes I fear that political theorists sort of mistake the order of things. We sort of put the moralizing before the understanding, but here I'm really endeavoring to do things the right way around. And the medical metaphor that I'm using, the metaphor of diagnosis, is itself an ancient one. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, who was himself the son of a doctor. So for Aristotle, what the politician or politikos knows, and so the politikos is he who knows about politics, what he knows is how to understand the constitution, or in Greek, politeia, of the city-state or polis, and specifically to understand that constitution as one would the constitution of a human body. So of course here, I hope many of you know this, but I'll just make it explicit. When I say constitution, I'm not talking about a written document or any kind of set of legal decrees. Politeia includes those, but it's also something more expansive, drawing in questions of nomos or nomoi more generally, cultural norms, and also the spirit of the laws, as Montesquieu might put it. So for Aristotle, the politikos had to understand the politeia, or constitution, in order to be able to articulate the principles of health on the one hand and sickness on the other. And so the work of political science then was the work of diagnosis. You had to be able to diagnose the malady afflicting your polis before you could accurately prescribe what to do about it. So in that Aristotelian spirit, I'm going to talk about just a few of the diagnoses that have been proffered in recent years, and then offer one of my own. So the first one I'd like to discuss, and it makes sense because I wrote about a book about civility, which had the good fortune to be published in January 2016. Normally there's not much of a market for academic monographs about early modern intellectual history, but somehow this one hit. I don't know what was up. But even then, in 2016, when lots of commentators were bemoaning a crisis of civility, right? Understanding the perceived erosion of American liberal democracy as a crisis of civility, there was already a sense that the complaint was somewhat old hat. It's 11 years ago now that President Obama spearheaded this campaign about civility in 2008, in the first years of his presidency. But even then, it was a long-standing complaint that the American Republic was facing a crisis of civility. And so it was my own deep skepticism about civility talk, as I put it, that led me to start looking into the history of civility and perceived crises thereof in order to understand what civility was and why it really mattered. And so, there are many speakers of Romance languages in this room. You'll know that the concept of civility has its roots in the Latin civilitas, meaning the art of good citizenship or government. And that classical Latin root, of course, civilitas, it's rooted in the idea of the civitas, so society, civil society or state. Noticing this, many commentators then, who wanted to apply this metaphorical frame of a crisis of civility to contemporary events, were tempted to turn civility then into a kind of catch-all civic virtue. This is very popular in the 80s and 90s, right? To understand civility as a matter of civic solidarity and social trust. But as I pointed out in my book, Mere Civility, the origins of the modern sense of civility crisis are actually much earlier. And when I say the modern sense of civility, I'm talking specifically about the idea of civility as a conversational virtue, one that's pertinent to disagreement in particular. And so in my book, I trace that modern sense of civility to early modern Europe and the Reformation, and specifically the perception of many Christians that the Reformation had somehow severed the vinculum societatis, the bond of society, which was associated with religious unity, and specifically communion, so participating in the sacrament of the Eucharist, right? When we've fallen out of communion with one another, how are we to hold our society together? And so in early modern Europe, this question of how to coexist unmurderously with people and with views that one considered to be, strictly speaking, damnable, was understood as a problem of civility. You know, so far, so familiar, right? This seems very often to be the problem that we're encountering. In the modern era, it can very often feel that modern political parties are comporting themselves a little bit more like religious sects, right? Who are concerned to anathematize and anathematize their opponents. And so the hope of thinkers in the 17th century was that the virtue of civility as a conversational virtue might make it possible for Christians and non-Christians alike. And of course, when I say non-Christians, that just means anyone who doesn't subscribe to your particular view of Christianity, was that civility could make it possible to share a life even when people did not share a faith any longer. And so what was interesting at the time, though, is while many commentators were converging on civility as the solution, everyone was defining civility and understanding what it required in vastly different ways. And that's very much the story I tell in my book. In any case, civility held out the hope for a conversational solution to what was construed as a conversational problem, right? If we diagnose the problem as a crisis of civility, we're indicating that there's a fairly straightforward way to cope with it. We must attend to the way in which we speak to one another, how we disagree, and if we get that right, then maybe even the mere act of talking about our differences can somehow bring us closer together. And of course, Aristotle could tell us, right, the prescription is implicit in the diagnosis there. If we describe it as a crisis of civility, we've implicitly suggested that we know how to solve it, and we just need to be more civil. But of course, I suspect many in this room would be skeptical, as I am, that one can observe that civility is in crisis, but that needn't imply that civility is then the cure, right? The loss of civility may well just be a symptom of a deeper malady. And other diagnoses are possible. So, for instance, we hear increasingly that liberal democracies like the United States or the United Kingdom are in what's effectively a state of submerged civil war, right? So we get the Civil War metaphor. As David Armitage pointed out in his recent book, this analogy between political polarization and civil war is quite popular at the moment, but also it's not exactly new. I mean, Newt Gingrich in 1988 declared that Republicans and Democrats were at war, but they were fighting with the ballot box, not with bullets. Gingrich's diagnosis would seem to vindicate the theories of so-called agonistic Democrats, right? Often left-wing followers of Carl Schmitt who understand, they follow Foucault in inverting Clausewitz. So it's not that war is politics by other means, rather it's politics is war by other means. So people like Chantal Mouffe want to describe democratic partisan conflict as itself a kind of agonism in which we regard one another as legitimate adversaries, and we're sort of fighting it out. But of course, if we apply that frame of civil war to contemporary concerns about the erosion of liberal democracy, for an agonistic Democrat, that's not really to say that there's anything aberrant going on at all. Civil war is not a malady then, it's just politics as usual. There's no need to make peace or to fight it out, because to be engaged in partisan contest is simply to be engaged in a kind of battle, engaged in what Emile Cioran would sort of observe as the innermost wish of every true patriot, the suppression of half of his co-citizens, right? That's just what politics is. But of course, I think that we can see there the limitations of the Civil War frame for actually understanding what is going on at the moment. The idea that it's not sufficient to win a democratic competition, but that what we're competing for is actually the capacity to rewrite the rules of the game rather than winning it. And so again, I'm with Aristotle in thinking that we can do a little better, and that the truly analytic work of political theory must be a form of political medicine that prioritizes the work of correct diagnosis, and that begins by identifying the state we're in as one of health or one of sickness, right? And so I conclude that American liberal democracy, many of the liberal democracies I know, are indeed in a state of sickness. But then the question is, what is the nature of that sickness? And so today I want to suggest to you that the right concept for understanding contemporary politics is actually a very ancient one. It's the concept of stasis, right? Stasis, which is very often translated as civil war, but in fact it means something a little bit different. The Greek word stasis means standing or taking a stand. It's from the same, it has the same root as static, right? But in modern Greek, stasis is the term for a bus stop, right? So what do I mean when I say that the contemporary liberal democracies are often in a state of stasis? Well, it's because standing still or standing apart looks quite different when we apply it to a political case. So let's consider the original and most influential account of stasis. That's which is given by Thucydides in Book 3 of his History of the Peloponnesian War. In Book 3, Thucydides tells us the story of the stasis in Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, in 427 BC. And Thucydides argues that stasis begins in Corcyra, and from there it spreads to all of the Hellenic world. On Thucydides' account, the troubles begin after Corcyra changes sides in the Peloponnesian War, from being an ally of oligarchic Corinth to allying themselves with democratic Athens. Right? The competition then over allegiances leads to the outbreak of violence, and Thucydides famously describes it thus, quote, "During 7 days, the Corcyrians were engaged in butchering those of their fellow citizens, polites in Greek, whom they regarded as their enemies, hostes. Death thus raged in every shape, and as usually happens at such times, there was no length to which violence did not go. Sons were killed by fathers, suppliants dragged from the altar or slain upon it. So bloody was the march of stasis," Thucydides continues, "that words had to change their ordinary meaning, and to take those which was now given to them. Reckless audacity came to be considered courage, prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for extreme unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, inaptness to act on any. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy, his opponent a man to be suspected, until even blood became a weaker tie than party." Right? So, we talk about a crisis of civility, right? The only thing missing is a complaint about fake news. Anyway, so given the high profile of violence and bloodshed in Thucydides' account, we can understand why in modern English stasis is often translated as civil war or revolution. But I think that the point he's getting at is slightly different. It's clear that Thucydides saw stasis as something different than war, polemos, as something more than just sedition. Stasis exists, according to Thucydides, even before there is any fighting or physical violence. It's fundamentally a state of mind, both individual and collective. Likewise, the point about stasis wasn't disloyalty per se, either in Thucydides' case or our own. It's rather a point about identity and the group psychology of believing and belonging that leads particular citizens to privilege their partisan political identities before their polis identities, right? So Thucydides has a particular framing for stasis. It then becomes a central problem in the political philosophy of both Plato and Aristotle, where it's often translated as faction, right? So the understanding that both Plato and Aristotle understand stasis as the worst fate to befall a polis is rendered in modern translation as the state of faction. But again, I don't think that's quite right. So consider the paradigmatic stasis for Plato. It's the division in society between rich and poor, which leads to, Plato describes, the emergence of two cities as opposed to one city. So a polis that's in stasis is actually it's two polis, not one. Aristotle figures this slightly differently. He says stasis has its origins in disagreements about justice. So again, this comes from the Politics. It's the idea that every person makes their own judgment about justice in their own case, but because we're notoriously bad judges in our own case, this leads to partial perspectives on justice. the idea, famously in the politics that Democrats believe that justice demands equality for everyone, whereas oligarchs believe that justice demands inequality for everyone, but both judge amiss because they're judging in their own case. Both Plato and Aristotle, again, understood stasis as originating in certain disagreements about the good and disagreements about justice. And Plato in the Republic famously says that the greatest good for a city is to be in a state of unity or like-mindedness, in Greek, homonoia. So a healthy city is one where people share opinions about justice and the good. Aristotle has always been more popular among modern democratic theorists because he seems to reject that Platonic solution and that emphasis on unity. Aristotle says in the Politics, Plato ended up turning harmony into a mere unison, right? Plato wants to reduce plural voices into one voice. But even Aristotle seemed to think that political friendship, as the bond of a particular kind of political community, relied on a certain like-mindedness about the fundamentals of the Constitution, right? He puts it in the Politics, quote, "Concord then seems to be political friendship, and it's found among good men, for they are in accord both in themselves and with one another, so to say, being of one mind, or in a state of homonoia." So it's not surprising that a lot of contemporary neo-Aristotelians, many of whom were talking about a crisis of civility in the 1990s, would want to avoid talking about the need for a kind of like-mindedness when it comes to having a healthy polis, or a polis that is at one with itself. But I think that's the question we really need to reckon with if we want to understand truly what the malady that's afflicting contemporary liberal democracies, especially when we're talking about an erosion of democratic norms. Just to put my cards on the table, I'm persuaded that the current state of liberal democracies in the United States or in the UK is one of stasis. I think it's really helpful to understand that there are in fact two cities, not one, that there's a sense of believing and belonging to political parties as opposed to belonging to the whole. But that rather than emphasizing the need for a fundamental agreement or consensus on the principles of justice, which is very often what political theorists like me like to do, I actually think it's worth sort of looking more closely at Aristotle's particular prescription, and specifically the idea that political friendship, which is very often described by Aristotelians and democratic theorists today as something that's meant to obtain between citizens. Namely, we're meant to feel friendly to one another. And of course, if that's the standard, then we're all doomed, because partisan conflict makes friendship tricky. But Aristotle's point seemed rather to be that citizens of a polis needed to feel themselves to be friendly to the Constitution. Right? So political friendship is really a sense of philia, or affiliation, to the Constitution itself. And of course, Aristotle had very Aristotelian methods of trying to bring this about. Education being the first political institution above all, but also questions of moderation. So if you have a democracy, well, try to make your democracy more oligarchic. Or if you have an oligarchy, make it more democratic. Or if you're a tyrant, be a little bit more like a king, right? So this is the famous Aristotelian moderation. And I'm not saying we want to take Aristotle's solutions, but I think the insight there is a sense that stasis occurs when citizens feel as though they no longer have a stake or a share in the Constitution, understood in this broad sense. And it doesn't, very often this gets rendered then in the language of equality. Well, in order for everyone to feel as though they have a share, then we need to make sure everyone has an equal share. Not so for Aristotle. The point is that everyone should feel they have some stake or some say, but that stake or say need not be equal, right? And so I will end my comments here, but simply to say, I think political theorists, as the tribe or party to whom I belong, have failed to reckon with the phenomenon of stasis as a kind of standing apart, in which we feel no longer to be parts of the same body. And that's not something that will be solved through the achievement of justice. I think that's the Aristotelian insight, or the achievement of equality. And so that's where my own thinking about constitutional matters has gone, basically to the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. But I'm hoping that my fellow speakers can push me a little bit further into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bejan. Now we will hear from Professor Wojciech Sadurski. Professor Sadurski is Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney and Professor of the Center for Europe at Warsaw University. He was a Professor of Legal Theory and Philosophy of Law at the European University Institute in Florence from 1999 to 2009, and Head of Department of Law at the EUI from 2003 until 2006. His most recent book, published by Oxford University Press this year, is entitled Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, and is an important study of democratic erosion in Poland. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sadurski.
Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Ross, Lorenzo, Sergio, and his team for inviting me to speak at this panel. And I'm particularly pleased that I can take part in such an excellent panel. I should make a disclaimer right at the outset. And that is that my thinking about democratic erosion around the world is very much colored by my knowledge of and partly my experience in mainly Poland, to some extent Hungary. So I do not have any universalizing lessons or conclusions to offer, even though in a very tentative way I will suggest by the end 2 general lessons which, who knows, may be applicable also to other countries. But basically, my thinking about the subject is quite Central European specific. And the choice of these 2 countries, which inform my thinking, that is Poland and Hungary, is based not just on my autobiographical reasons, but also because these are basically the only 2 European countries currently ruled by populists in which relatively deep and radical institutional changes, the changes in the structure of constitutional democracy, have been made. In other states currently ruled by populists in Europe, Italy, Czech Republic, Slovakia, no such changes so far have been made. So there is a good reason to focus in particular on these 2 countries. Now, one fundamental fact which raises all sorts of problems for us, that is, people believing in constitutional democracy and in a rights-respecting democracy, stems from the fact that much of the democratic erosion around the world is orchestrated by democratically elected leaders. If we look at the so-called 3rd wave autocratization, which began sometime in mid-1990s, and which of course followed the 3rd wave democratization. According to Professor Anna Luhrmann of Göteborg University, over 2/3 of cases of democratic decline were driven by democratically elected incumbents. And that produces for us both moral and cognitive problems. Moral problems are quite obvious. If we live in such societies, we encounter our compatriots whose electoral choices we deeply reject or deplore or not value. And this lack of value or respect for their choices is different, much more fundamental from a routine disagreement, political, moral, in a democracy. Of course, we constitutional theorists, we have a long repertoire of arguments, would say, well, democracy is not just a matter of counting heads. We do not believe in purely arithmetical democracy or statistical democracy. Fair enough, but these arguments go only so far, and we really have to think much harder about how to oppose persons, our fellow citizens, who tell us, but we are not statistics. We are real people, just like you, with our minds, with our wisdom, and with our hearts. However, in these remarks, I would like to focus on the second type of problems related to this democratic pedigree of democratic erosion, and these are what I would call cognitive or heuristic problems. These are problems related to factors which render democratic erosion somewhat obscure, somewhat invisible, perhaps even almost clandestine. One of them is pretty obvious, and that is that in all these cases, including cases of Poland and Hungary, democratic erosion proceeded incrementally, even though quite fast. And yet this gradual nature of democratic erosion produces a situation in which we don't have any clear turning point, any single event when we can say, oh, that's the point at which we have just crossed the line between democracy and something else. In their famous article, and then famous book, Aziz Hook and Tom Ginsberg use this unappetizing example of a boiling frog. And this metaphor, even I guess for the frog it's not much of a metaphor, served to show we really know that something really bad happened, already exposed. And that also renders to observers, especially external observers, these changes relatively innocuous. And the responses from us, liberal Democrats, to these changes can be characterized as being hysterical or perhaps even paranoid. This is related to the second characteristic of democratic erosion, and that is that more often than not, a really invidious effect is produced not by any single legal change or device or political action taken separately from others, but rather by the sort of negative, invidious interaction between different legal changes, because I have in mind mainly legal and constitutional changes. In his chapter in this great volume edited by Graeber, Levinson, and Tashnet, Professor Sujit Chowdhury uses a category of la suite polonaise, the set of different devices used by Polish populist government, which only taken together produce certain cumulative effect, which we don't see if we do not connect those dots. I'm using a metaphor of a virus. Virus in a healthy body doesn't produce much damage. In fact, it may be beneficial. It may strengthen autoimmune system. And yet virus in a sick body enhances the overall disease. And that's exactly what happens in countries such as Poland and Hungary when, if you take one case at a time or one instance at a time, the usual reaction is, but wait a moment, but they have similar things in Germany and in Spain and probably in Belgium, because basically in Belgium you can find equivalent of almost everything. I know it from my courses in comparative constitutional law. But the whole point is that we can see its effect only if we connect those dots. But perhaps the most important characteristic which renders democratic erosion so obscure is that today's populists, or authoritarians, or autocrats, usually do not destroy institutions. Sometimes they do, but more often than not, they don't. Rather than destroying institutions, they hollow them out of their original value and meaning. In that sense, to use a helpful word in a very important article by Professor Martin Krieger, which is about to appear in the European Journal of Constitutional Law, populists are deinstitutionalizers. This is quite a mouthful, and I wasn't sure whether I would pronounce it, but I'm so proud that I managed, so I'll repeat it. Deinstitutionalizers. Meaning that, and here Krieger follows his intellectual guru, Professor Philip Selznick, that institutions require certain values with which they must be imbued. But those values do not come from formal texts of constitutions or statutes which establish those institutions. They come from unwritten norms and conventions. Take the best or perhaps the worst example of Polish Constitutional Tribunal. It is there. And basically it is there running along according to the rules which had been in force in the good old pre-2015 days. And yet from a fundamentally counter-majoritarian institution, which it was meant to be, it was transformed into an enthusiastic, willing enabler of the government. So the institution is there, but it doesn't serve the values which were either taken for granted or only implicitly adopted when the institution was set up. And yet again, for external observers, the existence of these institutions may provide some consolation. Oh, well, there's not much that we should be worried about. After all, the courts are still there, constitutional tribunal is there, there isn't a political bureau set up instead of the government, and so on and so on. And let me mention the last point, and that is that in today's declining democracies, the pace of assault on different pillars of democracy is uneven. So if we think of democracy as basically consisting of three main pillars: free, fair, and regular elections, civil and political rights, especially those relevant to electoral choice, and separation of powers, or checks and balances. Today's authoritarians do not necessarily attack all three with equal zeal or anger. When you look at today's Poland, and I don't want to exaggerate this point, but I would say that by and large, fundamental rights are not adversely affected. Some of them are, but rather at the margins. Freedom of assembly. Neither is the electoral structure such that there has been any fundamental massive force of fraud in the recent elections. I have in mind European Parliament election and before local elections. Although the structure has been changed in a way in which such fraud is made possible. So from the point of view of these two pillars, not much damage has been done. But when you look at checks and balances, it is a total disaster. And all power, the entire political power, is concentrated in the hands of one person, of the supreme leader. So what lessons, and I'm coming close to an end of this, of this observation, what lessons can we draw from these cases, which perhaps may be of a larger relevance to us, public lawyers? And I would mention two. The first one is something that I would call, and I'm saying it with certain trepidation in this company, about relative irrelevance of constitutional design. And I know that, it may sound like anathema for us lawyers, because especially constitutional lawyers, we believe that constitutional design matters. And of course it does matter. But it matters, and constitution design may render institutions more or less resilient in the circumstances of weak or moderate assault upon the institutions. When the assault is orchestrated by determined, committed, forceful authoritarians, especially if they feel that they have significant societal support, no amount of smart constitutional design can render those institutions resilient. And nothing can help their self-defense. So if you look at Poland and Hungary, of course we now know that the Constitutional Tribunal was the first institution which was attacked. And we may speculate that actually in the case of these only two post-communist countries, all constitutional judges are elected exclusively by the parliament. So I would say it's a bad design, because it helps authoritarians to pack the court with their people. Yeah, but on the other hand, you have Germany, where you also have the same system. And yet, thanks to sub-constitutional laws, and to political culture, and to legal unwritten norms, which drive the necessity for consultation between parties, you do not have a situation that winner takes all. So I would say that the importance of constitutional design is greatly overrated. And my second lesson is that perhaps we need to definitely and finally announce the end of what may be called transition paradigm. And here I'm not terribly original in it, because American political scientist Thomas Carothers already in an article in Journal of Democracy in 2002 said that, even in the title of his article, but we didn't listen to him. And that was the paradigm which suggested, well, we have a number of countries which emerged from various horribly oppressive systems: communism, apartheid, military regimes, sort of other autocratic regimes, say in East Asia, but they are on a certain trajectory from point A to point B. And point B is more or less the same: liberal democracy. And, I myself sort of subscribe to this paradigm, and I believe that you will excuse me, perhaps even thank me for not going into detail of it, perhaps because it's now rendered totally redundant. Now we see that there are so many states which are neither terribly oppressive nor consolidated democracy, and we do not see the trajectory there. They are either in a state of a certain plateau, Ukraine, Russia, or actually are in the state of catastrophic decline or backsliding from a relatively good position of consolidated democracy, like Poland and Hungary. So these countries, one may say these are hybrid regimes, and the pathway is not necessarily obvious. They may move either towards more autocratic system or to liberal democracy. Unfortunately, we have precious few examples of the latter trajectory, that is, where such a hybrid, populist-governed authoritarian state moves back as a result of the election to liberal democracy. In a recent book called Populism and Liberal Democracy, a Greek political scientist, Takis Papas, has identified 8 countries only, which he called consolidated populist states, that is, states in which populists governed for more than one consecutive term. And he found only one case in which such a consolidated populist state transitioned into liberal democracy. And that is Ecuador. So to conclude this otherwise grim presentation, and also to pay my respect and tribute to this wonderful region in which this conference is hosted, let me finish with a call, Viva el Ecuador. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sadurski. Finally, we will hear from Samuel Issacharoff. Professor Issacharoff is the Rice Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law. He is the author of Fragile Democracies, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. He's also one of the pioneers of the law of political process, where his Law and Democracy casebook and many articles helped to shape a new area of constitutional law. He served as reporter for the Principles of Aggregate Litigation of the American Law Institute, and he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Let's welcome Professor Issacharoff.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It is the custom in Latin America that the last speaker of a conference, and that's me, summarizes everything that happened over the course of the conference. So let me be faithful to our cultural traditions here. I'm originally from Argentina, and so I will do so. To the question, are we in times of change? Yes. What kind of change? Bad. How bad? Here there was a range of opinion over the many days. Pretty bad, very bad, not so bad, not so sure. So that's basically what we did. Now I say this to introduce a slightly more serious theme, which is about a decade ago, maybe a little more, I started to devote myself to what we now call comparative constitutional law, and a little less to issues in governance and American constitutional law. And I did so in part because of the drama of the changes in post-'89, in the post-'89 world, whether in Eastern Europe, South Africa, Pacific Rim, South America, but also because of the tremendous sense of optimism. What characterized this field was that we genuinely believed that the tools that we had of constitutional law, constitutional courts, and democratic commitments of governance could change the lives of people and could result in lasting, better conditions for citizens of countries who were formerly oppressed in some kind or another of autocratic regime. What is most striking today is the loss of that sense of optimism. And there is a sense of despair that things are going badly and that we don't quite know how to check it, and that the very institutions that we created, democratic accountability, elections, have been hijacked by people who are able to make crude, vulgar promises to the masses of people, play to anger, resentment, even in conditions like Poland, where the results of the transition have been such an improvement in material conditions. It is despairing. And it is worse that the institutions that we thought would be the catalyst for the new democratic order, these strong constitutional courts that were established all over the world in the post-'89 period, that they in turn have been captured in country after country. And so we face the consequence that democracy is not necessarily liberal, it's not necessarily tolerant, and that constitutionalism can make it worse. And that's a change. I was criticized for some of the last chapters of my book on fragile democracies for being too pessimistic. I was asked, why such pessimism? And my answer was very simple. I started writing the book at the height of the Arab Spring, and I finished it as Assad crushed the Syrian opposition. If you can remain optimistic in that circumstance, you're a better person than I am, because that's the reality of the world we face. And in this world, we have to come back to certain core questions And I want to go back to one of the oldest ones in our tool chest, which is the role of the courts and the justification for the courts if they are to be a brake on this kind of populist abuse and capture of democracy. And so the question is, what should courts do? What can they do? And I want to change the question a little bit. But first I want to read you 3 quotes. And the quotes are, those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we've all just finished grading. So this is like an exam. So you have to think, do you know who wrote this? So the first one is, what reason can there be for wanting to set up a non-elective process to review and sometimes override the work that the legislature has done? That's quote number 1. Quote number 2, only a legislature can provide an equitable process for deciding between individuals' often competing claims. And quote number 3, in a democracy, the sovereign is the people, the representatives in parliament, and the elected president. If we are to have a democratic state of law, no state authority, including a constitutional tribunal, can disregard legislation. They're similar. The first one is my friend and colleague, Jeremy Waldron. The second is Richard Bellamy. And the third is Jaroslaw Kaczynski. Now, to be a little fair, not too much, but a little fair, for Waldron, of course, there's an assumption that there's an idealized state of democratic deliberation, that the institutions are in good working order. Bellamy has the same qualifiers that define a role of political society unlike what we have. Kaczynski has no qualifier. For him, it is just the question of raw power. And so I want to talk about judicial review in the world not of the political theorists, but in the world of Kaczynski. Kaczynski is the concern I have, and not some idealized state that I can't put a finger on a map anywhere in the world. And so in this world of Kaczynski, and you can substitute Orban, you can substitute Erdogan, I don't care. But in this world, what is the justification for judicial review? And I want to get at this by suggesting that there are 3 different functions that we should disaggregate because the logic of each is different and the problematic increases over the 3. And the 3 are the preservation of rotation in office, the preservation of what I'm going to call the soft power of institutional constraints, and the third is filling the void for state incompetence or dysfunctionality. And they have different valences. So to the first, preserving democratic accountability. Mila Verstag of Virginia and some collaborators have a new study, which is quite eye-opening. In it, they established that roughly 1/3 of the elected governments in the world have recently tried to amend the laws governing the selection of government in order to preserve in office the incumbents, right? So this is done through abolition of term limits, through various other mechanisms, but it's, we have political power, we're going to change things to keep ourselves in power. In 2/3 of those cases, that is about 20% of the elected governments in the world, that is done through constitutional amendment, but it's not always done through constitutional amendment. And so there are challenges that come when the government moves on the democratic process itself. And for those in the audience, there's great familiarity. This is what began in India with the basic structures doctrine. We've all been exposed to, read about, written about cases like the Colombian Constitutional Court denying President Uribe a 3rd term. And to me, the case that's most characteristic is one from Taiwan involving what's called, from 2000, called Interpretation Number 499. And the Taiwanese example is exactly what we are concerned about in the backsliding context. So Taiwan, post-49, single-party state, Kuomintang dominates everything, they hold all power, they get voted down. For the first time, they lose an election. They see the writing on the wall. So what do? They say, with regard to one of the chambers of the legislature, what they call the constitutional chamber, they will amend the Constitution. And the amendment stands as follows. No more elections for several years. That's always a good move, a good democratic move. And the second one is, from here on out, the constitutional chamber will no longer be directly elected. It will be apportioned in proportional power, proportional representation to the parties currently in the parliament, which is a way of ensuring Kuomintang control in perpetuity, perhaps. And in its first act as an independent tribunal, sensing that there was some aperture in which it could act, the Taiwanese Constitutional Court struck that down and has a phrase which I think is the heart of the concern of what we have. And the phrase is that this change in electoral rules violates the constitutional order of democracy. Now, obviously, that's abstract, but it gets at the heart of the issue, that one justification for judicial review is that democracy itself is imperiled. And for thinkers like Waldron and Bellamy, they have no account for this. They just say, assume a well-functioning democracy. You know, it's the two economists stuck on an island, a can floats up, they are starving, and one of them says to the other, assume a can opener. Okay, let's assume well-functioning democracies. We just happen not to have them, but let's assume them. Now, this is not just a problem of transition regimes. This is a problem that's found in every democratic society right now. So take, for example, the United States. The Republican Party loses elections in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina. What do? On their way out the door, they try to rewrite the conditions of the governorship in those states. Now, there's no fundamental democratic principle that says a governor must have 200 as opposed to 75 appointments, or must be able to appoint the entire, or as opposed to the partial board of regents of the state university. That's arbitrary. But changing the rules to favor incumbent power goes to the heart of violation of democracy. And there, the courts must play a role, because if we are to avoid stasis, or the other translation, civil war, there must be a sense that you lose today, you can win tomorrow. And that sense of repeat play is what's at stake. Nancy Rosenblum calls that a regulated rivalry. Michael Ignatieff says, democracy turns on the sense that we have adversaries within the system but not enemies. And that's really a core issue that the judiciary can intervene in. That's one. Second is soft power. So this is a harder claim to make. But soft power, I mean that there is a distribution of authority within the government, even beyond the formal constitutional separation of powers. There have to be norms of restraint. And can courts intercede to protect those? It's a harder argument, but let me give you a couple of examples. One is from Canada. The Quebec secession case is a perfect example of a case in which courts forced a dialogue. Pojin Yap refers to this as the dialogic intervention. Forced a dialogue among the various political actors that actually had the effect of resolving the Quebec secession issue for an entire generation. In South Africa, the South African courts, both the appellate court and then ultimately the constitutional court, in dealing with the repeated issue of corruption and the attempt to maintain the independence of the public prosecutor or the ombudsman-style authority, their final judgments were fascinating. They said, we find this arrangement to be impermissible, but we send it to the parliament in order that there be a negotiated resolution of how to do this. And that had the effect of ultimately bringing down Zuma, because it forced a parliamentary congressional discussion of what is the proper independence of these kinds of institutions. There was a wonderful paper presented yesterday by Yaniv Roznai on procedural interventions into Knesset dysfunction in Israel that had the result of restoring ordinary democratic processes there. And I would add finally, the Miller decision. I know this position is disagreed with by everybody to whom I've expressed it, but nonetheless, I'm right. The Miller decision was, in Britain, the Brexit decision, was a declaration by the English Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court, that the Prime Minister and her cabinet could not resolve Brexit, that it was a parliamentary democracy that existed in Britain. It had to go back to Parliament for them to decide. Now, they decided stupidly. They just sent it right back to the Prime Minister. They passed an act saying so, but that forced them to take responsibility, and you see the wonders of how it's worked out. Well, sometimes it doesn't work out, but we leave that aside. Now, the last one is the issue of compensating for state incapacity. And this is most difficult. This is where I think the courts get into a lot of trouble and provoke a lot of antagonism. Many of you will know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about social rights questions. I'm talking about provision of social welfare benefits. And I think that here it is important to distinguish two different areas. One is areas where the state just doesn't have the capability. So my favorite example of this is India, where there is a mechanism for direct popular appeal, popular access to the Supreme Court for the effectively an injunctive type remedy. And so people have gone to the Supreme Court in India demanding, do something about the Taj Mahal. We have an incompetent state government. It's threatened by pollution. And the government said, the Supreme Court said, okay, we'll take it up. We'll move all industry at least 20 miles from the Taj Mahal. We'll ban all motor cars except for electric cars. Extraordinary judicial conduct. There was another problem. There were too many monkeys running around in New Delhi, in the woods, in the forested areas of New Delhi. So the Supreme Court is invoked, and they say, very well, Zoo Authority of New Delhi, you're now an involuntary party. We order you to remove all the monkeys. And they did it. And the Taj Mahal is beautiful. And so there is a temptation to use the courts because of governmental insufficiency. Not just in third world countries, not just in India, in the United States. Why are we litigating the opioid crisis? Because we have insufficiency or incapacity in our political institutions to deal with something of that magnitude. But the second is the pure social rights claims. And here the question is not governmental incapacity, but either dysfunction or an attempt to go around the political process. And this is what is most difficult, I think, for the courts today. And you've noticed I've left completely to the side the rights questions. I want to get to the structures of governance. I'm really not interested in the rights declaration, which is where the debate on judicial review usually begins and usually ends, and it's can Parliament or the courts better recognize rights. I'm talking about the governance. I'm talking about the issue of democratic governance, which is the source of so much of the social anger today. And here, I want to raise a caution. There's I think it's a brilliant article by Justice Barroso in the most recent American Journal of Comparative Law. And in it, Justice Barroso makes the following argument. We all know that there's a public choice critique of democratic institutions. They get captured by minorities, and they get captured by powerful minorities. And we pretend like that has no implications. And he argues that in countries where there is just capture and dysfunction, and Brazil is obviously high on the list right now, that the only institution that is not subject to the public choice paradox is the judiciary. And that the judiciary may have greater legitimacy than other institutions in addressing social problems. And here we run into two fundamental problems. And I say this with all respect. Justice Barroso is sitting right there, and he's going to be mad at me again, but we have been friends so far. I say there's two independent problems here. One is just a capability question. When people look at the social rights decisions, have they resulted in the benefits that were promised? are courts institutionally capable of delivering quality medical goods? They are capable of emergency responses, the lack of water services, holding government authorities to their pre-existing plans. That's been done in Brazil, it's been done in Colombia, it's been done in India, it's been done in many places. But are they capable of declaring through rights and other judicial mechanisms how to reorder the allocation of resources in the society? I am skeptical. And in these cases, unfortunately, we come back to the fundamental question about the democratic mandate of the courts. And so I want to suggest that there's certain areas where we should just put behind us the whole discussion about the legitimacy of court intervention. When courts intervene to preserve democratic accountability against the incumbents, shutting the door behind them, there's just no question. When courts try to intervene to force the institutions of society to play their role, the separation of powers type logic, there should be no question because they're trying to empower inter-branch dialogue. When courts have to assume a role because of the increasing incapacity of the state, because the legislatures are not working in democratic societies, because the ability to respond to popular needs has been lessened by the failure of political parties and other institutions of democratic governance, I think the question there is actually the one that we have the most trouble with, because the demands are there, the needs are there, but the legitimacy concerns and whether this ultimately undermines democracy, that's a central concern in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Issacharoff. These are three incredibly rich presentations. I wish we could spend a long time discussing them. Alas, we're essentially at the end of our time of this session, and so I want to remind you, please stay seated. We're going to move immediately to the closing remarks of Professor Lorenzo Casini to end the conference. So please stay where you are. No, stay if it's okay, Sorry.
Thank you very much. First important announcement, we found several lost objects. There is Mariana Canales at the corner there, so we found glasses, laptops, cell phones. So I think that there is someone here that should go there and find the lost objects. So in this closing remarks part, we have to deal with three topics. The first is Thanksgiving. The second is the awards, so the Icon Awards for the best article and the Icons Book Prize. And you will listen to short remarks on myself, on the status of the society, and on the conference. So let's start with Thanksgiving, that it's the most important thing, and usually people leave as flights to be catch, so it's important to mention who make all this possible. I mean, beside the speakers that we have already thanked and all the other people. So on the IconS side, for the organizing committee, let me thank Ran Hirsch, Gronia de Burca, David Landau, and Ruth Rubio Marin, and Joseph Weiler. On Santiago side here, we have a line of people really we have to thank. Mariana Canales, Fernanda Farcu, Carolina Larrain, Antonia Paul, Mariano Pola, Diego Tagle, and Luis Carlos Valdés. Then we have very special thanks to Gabriel Boxang, the Dean of the Law Faculty, and to Francisco Urbina, who you met, who chair the first plenary as Gabriel chair the other plenary, and Cristian Valenzuela, who worked very, very hard to have all the classrooms set for us for the conference. So an applause to them. And now we turn to the people who are working all the year in order to have ICON S existing. And we have our Secretary General, Richard Albert. I don't know if he's here in the room, but you know him quite well, so a special thanks to him. And then we have our treasurer, Claudia Golden, who really makes things work, as you can imagine. Plus, Fred Zaumsal is not here, but is the head of communication, and if the website and Twitter exist, it's because of him. I'm almost there, don't worry. And the last people I want to thank here, you might have received several emails, so many emails that some people ask me, do you have an answering machine called Felicia Caponigri? So, or is there a person? She's a person. She works for ICON S. She was responsible for the emails. Felicia, where are you? So thanks for all what you have done. At the very, very last, we have to thank our Deputy Secretary General, Sergio Verdugo. And Sergio Verdugo, I mean, has so many hats in these events, being Chilean and also being responsible for the journal, to the extent that some people ask me, is the same Sergio Verdugo doing all these things? And I said, yes, it's him, the journal and the society and the conference. And I asked Sergio and Marcela Prieto, the associate editor of the journal, and Joseph Weiler, the editor-in-chief, to come here on stage because there will be the award ceremony for the best ICON article. So please come.
So just a word on ICON. We think we're doing okay. I know everybody is enthralled to all the sort of hard indicators, impact factors, citations. I'm very skeptical, but we're doing well in all those areas. OUP tells us that we had last year 650,000 downloads. I've asked them to audit it 3 times, and they said it's absolutely real. I don't believe it. But even if there were 65,000 downloads, it's the second best in the stable of OUP. Only EGIL has a little bit more. So, but the real thing is, I hope you find ICON an interesting journal with high quality articles. And I hope you continue to submit.
Thank you all. This has been a wonderful conference. Now we need to inform about the ICON prize for the best journal of 2018. So this prize is delivered by the ICON board of members. We vote, it's a democratic procedure, and then the editors-in-chief decide. And we have a tie between 2 articles. So for the first one, by decision of the board of editors and the scientific advisory board, the 2019 ICON prize for the most outstanding article, the first one, is awarded to David McGrogan for his article, The Population and the Individual, the Human Rights Audit as the Governmentalization of Global Human Rights Governance. So I invite David to please approach the stage.
And the second award goes to Alexandra Huneus for her article co-authored with Michael Rasmussen, Between Universalism and Regional Law and Politics, a Comparative History of the American, European, and African Human Rights System. So we ask Alexandra Huneus to please come to the stage and proceed with it.
So it's now time for the award of the ICONS Book Prize, and you know that we established a committee for that. The committee is chaired by Ann Peters, and the members are Giulio Napolitano, Michaela Hellbronner, and Yaniv Rosnai. I kindly ask Giulio Napolitano to come here.
So good afternoon, everybody. I speak on behalf of all the jury. Unfortunately, Ann Peters was unable to come here. We were all very honored to be members of this jury. Let me start with very few words about the process of selection we followed. We received more than 40 nominated books by publishers as well as by ICONS members, and we all examined those books in details. Then we agreed on a short list of 10 books. We all carefully read the 10 shortlisted books, and then finally we made difficult choices because we very much appreciated all the received books, but finally we had to inspire our choice on the standards and criteria of selection that were indicated in the call, giving preference to books that have an interdisciplinary approach and that bridge gaps between different fields of the public law and between public law, political science, sociological and economic approaches. So at the end of our assessment, we decided to follow a kind of sport competition approach, creating a kind of ideal podium with 3 selected books and with a ranking. So let me start with the third in our ranking, which is the book by Robert Schutze. The title is From International to Federal Market, The Changing Structure of European Law. Robert, unfortunately, is not here, but let me read very shortly the motivation. In our opinion, this is a fascinating book in which the author offers a rereading of the European integration process that challenges established wisdom and widens our horizon in understanding the European cases. Using a comparative examinations of the models of market integration and placing the construction of internal markets in a historical perspective, it explores the transformation of Europe against this broader backdrop and generates new insights. So maybe we can clap to him even if he is not here currently. Then, in the second place in our ranking, we selected the book by Kwai Hang Ng and Xin He, Embedded Courts, Judicial Decision-Making in China. We really appreciated this book because it's based on extensive field work and in-depth interviews. This book overcomes the idea that there is a monolithic or uniform judicial system working in China, despite the existence, of course, of uniform rules. What is important is to go in depth in the operations of courts and carefully assessing the differences between urban and district courts, the different legal training of judges, and the relevant factors that from a political, economic, social standpoint shape the different approaches of Chinese judges. This book is focused on China, but it has also a comparative view on different judicial systems, and it's very important because it combines a legal approach with a sociological and economic understanding of the role of courts in China. So. And finally, we come to the winner, and which is by chance perfectly in line and coherent with the topic we discussed in our last panel in this fantastic plenary session. And the book is by Tom Ginsburg and Eddie Q, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. I saw Tom is here, and it's impossible not to see him with this fantastic shirt. And let me first read the motivation. Tom Ginsburg and Isaac Hughes' book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, deals with one of the most pressing constitutional law questions of our times: how legal and constitutional design matters to the resilience of democracies to the contemporary threats. To answer that question, the authors draw on empirical research, including quantitative data, on theory, and on case studies from a wide range of countries and regions. This book is pleasantly written and carefully argued. And it avoids, on one side, the over-dramatization that characterizes some of the recent literature. At the same time, it takes the risks and threats of our times very seriously. In contrast to other books on the death of democracy, its mission is to safeguard and improve the functioning of constitutional democracy's mechanisms. And to this purpose, constitutional and legal design can still play a very relevant role, even if the limits of law in this regard are clearly acknowledged by the authors. The authors start by setting out a theoretical argument about what constitutional democracy entails. And to this purpose, they include not only the functioning of purely political institutions or separation of powers mechanisms, but they also pay attention to the functioning and the respect of fundamental freedoms, and to the role of sub-constitutional institutions, such as what they call the administrative rule of law. They then offer a very impressive comparative analysis of democratic erosion more than democratic collapse in a host of different states, not confined to one particular region. And the list and the cases that are provided by the authors is really impressive. These insights subsequently furnish a standard for evaluating the US situation, thereby rejecting any claim of American exceptionalism. Finally, the authors propose a set of mechanisms to respond to current threats and assist alongside civic and political activism in protecting the constitutional democratic order. We really believe that this impressive book, combining practical with academic arguments, is a model of engaged scholarship, addressing one of the most central problems faces public law in our era. And let me give you this very important official.
This is fantastic.
And
I
for
can
the
deliver
author,
this.
thank you very much indeed.
All right, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, thank you.
So we can now dedicate this final part to the very end of the conference. So as promised, I will give you a few remarks on the status of the society and on the conference itself. You see here Santiago. We are going to say goodbye to this wonderful city and to what we learned and we experienced here. I must say that I'm truly in debt to Sergio and Marcella, because I really realize why Orson Welles, Ernest Hemingway, or Clark Gable, or Ava Gardner were so obsessed with Pisco. So Pisco is the response to being 3 days in a conference like this and following all the panels, and Pisco is the solution. So this is something that we learned together with other things. But now, I made an experiment during these days to test our community. And the test was the following, that people were asking, where are we going next year? So where are we going in the next conference? And I seriously responded, Antarctica. See, showing this picture, there are people already thinking of the panels and setting the venue, so you will be very happy. And the reaction to this experiment was, I mean, people know that 90% of the things I say and I write are jokes, but for the other people saying seriously, reacting like, well, yes, nice, we go, we come. Yes, we are happy to go there. One person says, well, cool. I say, well, definitely. But the point is that, seriously, what I learned is that the dedication to the ICONS community and to the ICONS conference and the desire to be here, to discuss, to make research, to make this transboundary discussion that we had also in this plenary is so strong that even proposing Antarctica never created a true problem to the possibility of this. We are not going to Antarctica, so this is something I wanted to clarify. But so what about this community? We should consider that we are growing, so we have now almost 1,000 members, and we have a number of almost 4,000 people who were members of ICONS during these years. And the composition of this membership is always very, very good in terms of diversity, gender balance, age, geographic distribution. We have over 70 countries represented. So really, we are very, very happy about that. And Rosalind Dixon and I wrote an editorial on ICON, try to describe what is the future of the society, and so what we expect from the society, and you will find there many of the things that we already said and we try also to do. So one goal was to be in South America and to expand the society here. And thinking that we had also panel in Spanish and we had this inclusion and involvement of local scholars, we were quite happy with the result. Of course, the reason of the success of these events is because of you, is because of people coming. And so we are very happy to receive any possible suggestion or comments or whatever you think is appropriate. Send it to Ross and me and Richard and Sergio and all the ICONS team in order to be sure that we get improving all the time. So now the final part of, before announcing where we are going next year's, of what we learned from this conference. So now we are entering in a very short part of remarks. It's not easy, of course, thinking of what we have seen and the variety of the panels that we had. So I will try to summarize what we had in 3 words and in 3 concepts, and I will spend a few words on each of them. The first concept is technology. The second is state. And the third one is movement. So let's start with technology. I took this picture and I thought of this picture after that we have seen the eclipse yesterday. Because if you remember what happened, there were many, many people doing not this, but this. The sun was there, but including myself. I mean, I was doing this. I was trying to take the picture. And at the very moment, there was like a 4:36, 4:37, I was trying to download instruction from how to take a picture with the iPhone, because I just yelled someone who did it for Androids and not for iPhone. And then I stopped myself and saying, okay, when I will be back in Italy and my son will ask, did you see the eclipse? And they say, no. Why? I was looking at internet in order to find the instruction to download how to take a picture of the eclipse. Now, the point is that technology really affects our perception of reality. And as scholars, what we should avoid, and is something that happens, is to consider technology just as a hot topic. So we talk about algorithm and we think that that's enough, but we don't go through it. But I think that it's something that emerged in the Justice Barroso keynote speech and also in the first judiciary panel. That was how, I mean, the Justice Diaz Picasso clearly stated how technology is affecting public opinion and the way in which public opinion is formed. And I will add also how language is changing. So I want you to leave with one reflection on these. States, public institutions, I mean, history teaches that they were built on writing. So there is the shifting of language from orality to writing. Now technology is changing the very essence of writing. I'm not thinking about WhatsApp vocal messages, but the way in which text and things are written are completely changed, and to the extent that now the power of administration and institution, international organization, is data. So it's not anymore all the written documents that we learned that was the key point in building states and institutions. And this brings me to the second word, state. Now here, of course, I use the word state because many people observed during this conference that there was this focus on constitution, of course, on democracy. And so if I try to answer the question that Professor Issacharoff just responded, so how is it going? No, bad. So if you ask, how is the state? Not the democratic state, not the constitutional state. How is the state? Well, I'm not sure that the response is bad. Because the concept of state, the super concept of state, the Oberbegriff, I mean, it's doing well. Number of states is increasing. We have more states. There is this desire to be a state. And so the very concept of state is in crisis since centuries. I mean, devalued state, the crisis of national state, but the state itself is still there and is still our point of reference in our study. Of course, if we turn to democratic state, to democracy, to constitutional state, then I quite agree on the fact that the response is the one that you offered, and is what we learned here in several panels. So I say this because something that I observed also in the conference is that there was this sometimes too simplistic idea that there is either a crisis of the state or crisis of globalization. So the point is that both globalization and states are growing, and states are using globalization even in order to strengthen themselves. So those questions are there since decades, and it's quite crucial that we as a scholar try to unpack the complexity of this dialectic. Of course, technology affects state, and the digital state is one of the topics that was discussed in several panels. And one of the reactions of state against this is what Beth Simmons clearly stated, with showing us barriers and walls and all of this. This brings us to another concept that is the third one, movement. Movement of things, movement of ideas, movement of people. I mean, you know that scholars observed already how globalization developed for the globalization of things, globalization of ideas due to internet, but the globalization of people is not so present. You see here the passport index, and I mean, if you see how many people in the world are not able really to travel, I mean, no matter of the condition, they simply cannot access another country. So this is something that was highlighted also in the plenary by Gabriel Boxang and the importance of studying migration. But this is something that we should consider when we also realize how lucky we are in a conference like this that we are able to be all here, even though in ICONS as well, we had problems sometimes with visa, with having people coming because of this, because of the fact that not all states are the same in terms of their passport power. I mean, according to this index, United Arab Emirates are the first in terms of countries that you can access with that passport. So this is something that, of course, is connected to the other concept with technology as well. There was a very interesting panel on global data, and it was a paper presented of algorithm used in order to control borders and to see how algorithm might use in order to control the borders of different countries. And so I tried with these three concepts and ideas, technology, state, and movement, to embrace all the different fields and disciplines that we have in ICONS. So not only the constitutional dimension, but also the international and the administrative dimension. That is one of the secrets of our success. But now, we are in the moment where we should think of our future. And I kindly ask Rosalind Dixon to come here, because we are going to, I mean, as you wish. I mean, so you let, I know. Okay. So we, as usual, we had our meetings with the governing bodies yesterday night, and we wanted to do something different this year, so we decided where to go, not only in 2020, but also in 2021. So we are now ready to announce both destinations. As for 2020, we decided, also looking at what we discussed in previous conference and what we discussed here, and I think that this final plenary is a clear example, to move to Wrocław in Poland. So you do not have to move from here, so you can go back home and then wait for the call for papers, and so don't worry. So this is something that will be in July 2020. Wrocław is a wonderful city, and we truly believe that going there would have been very important for the mission of the society. Now, as I told you, we wanted to, do our homework in advance, so we decided also where to go in 2021. And there was a wonderful bid. I studied sports law for many, many years. I'm quite sure that for some Olympics, the bid was not that accurate as the one that we received from New Zealand in 2021. So I was not that sincere about Antarctica, but as you see from the map, but at least it's something that we will be quite happy to do. As Italian, I can tell you, Italy is the farthest point from New Zealand, because it's the antipodes. So either we dig or we don't have any other mean to go there. Finally, so I need to stress on this, because I do believe that technology is our time, is our challenge. Justice Barroso was quite clear on that. He quoted the George Orwell novel. He said that dystopia didn't happen. I'm not so sure. I think that we went beyond that dystopia for something. And so this is a sort of call to action to all of us, considering that we cannot escape studying how technology is affecting our field. And above all, we are academics, we are teachers. We are not only scholars and researchers. So we always say that school, university needs technology, but technology needs school, needs to be educated. And this is our task. This is our task to unpack the complexity of technology and their effects. So what is really our task, the task of the society, in each conference, we started in Florence with rethinking the boundaries of public law. We had in Berlin borders. So we always wanted to challenge the very concept of boundaries or borders. So we want to break those fences. We want to break those boundaries. We want to have all the borders and boundaries transpassed by interdisciplinarity, dialogue, research, and above all, and this is my final concept, knowledge. Thank you. So you're free.